thank you for attending late in the day for a discussion that we are very excited about, and hope that we'll have some active participation later on in the session. Firstly, to introduce the panel, who have a lot of different experiences and knowledge that I think can be very helpful in thinking about the very important topic of gender diversity. On my far right is Ana Maria Carrasquilla, who is the Executive Chairman and President of FLAR, which is a reserve holding institution for Latin American central banks. So a very senior person in the central banking world. To her left is John Coombe, a consultant based in Australia. To my right is Claire Cockerton, who is with Innovate Finance in London, and who combines two very macho areas, finance and technology. So I think there's an interesting challenge there as to how to operate in that sector, and I'll be interested to hear what Claire has to say. On my left is Dr. Fan Hua of the China Investment Company in Beijing. Dr. Fan has a very interesting background, having worked in both New York and Beijing. So I think some comparative could be quite interesting. And then last but not least, on my far left is Alexis Krivkovich, who is a partner in McKinsey and who has been very involved in their work on businesses and how gender diversity both affects businesses and how to achieve more. So I think there's a lot of interesting experience and knowledge on the panel, so I hope you can take most advantage of it. In introduction, I would suggest that the benefits of gender diversity are actually pretty well accepted. You know, you don't really have to say very much to understand it. How can businesses possibly succeed if their top ranks ignore half the world's population? I mean, that's just frankly silly. And I think that when you look at it that way, there's also a lot of evidence that diverse teams do better business. And in that, it's gender, racial, cultural, and language diversity that really makes businesses perform in a superior way. So I think that case is quite well established. What I'm really hoping to get out of this panel is, from the very eminent and experienced people we have here, some advice and help and support in how to make it work in different situations. So I think it's how to execute better. Not surprisingly, McKinsey have taken a very data-driven approach to looking at diversity. And perhaps for that reason, I'd like to start with Alexis and have her give some of the background that they see from a very global perspective.
Great. Thanks, Jim. So we've been doing research on this question of gender diversity since 2011. Most recently, we have underway a large-scale effort in partnership with Lean In and Sheryl Sandberg to refresh and expand that data, and have a number of companies, about 100 Fortune 500 institutions in the US this year, and next year we'll expand it globally, where we're focused on this question of what does the data look like today in a very granular way when it comes to gender diversity and pipelines for men and women, as well as questions around attitudes and perceptions of how things operate out in the real world and experiences people have as they move across levels in companies. So what I'll share with you today is some of the previous research we've done over the past few years, and I think we have an article here that encapsulates some of that in case folks were interested at the end, but also a little bit of what's hot off the presses. We're literally in the process of aggregating thousands of data points as we speak, so I have a few cheat sheet notes on the not yet ready for prime time, but some of what we're seeing right now. That'll be part of a published piece with the Wall Street Journal later this year, and so I thought that might be interesting to the group. When we look at best-in-class companies around gender diversity, which frankly these days are those that are taking an active approach to managing the question of gender diversity, there are really 5 areas that are the focus of what people are trying to do. The first is really understand the talent pipeline in a fairly granular way. So the good news for a lot of institutions is they feel like they're pulling their fair share of diverse candidates into the front end of the pipeline when it comes to gender. So roughly 50%, if you look at the averages. Now the averages hide a lot of variability across industry, but general 50% of women on the front end. The bad news is as you migrate towards the C-suite, that drops by half. So there's a significant issue in the pipeline, and what you find is it's a leaky pipeline throughout. So there are issues all along the way. The positive we're seeing is that institutions that we call best in class that are actively managing their pipeline are seeing differentially better results. So those that are actively engaged in processes around gender diversity, and I'll talk about what some of those are, they're seeing more like 30% women in the C-suite relative to those who are not today, and they're seeing more like 19%. So the case is there, as Jim said, that active management is providing results. And one of the key pivot points institutions are finding is in that middle management layer, that if you can really engage in that middle management point, it's, for a lot of institutions, you see problems throughout the pipeline, but if you can get plugged in there, you can see a lot of that transition over time to the executive suite. And so that's where a lot of institutions are focused today because it's a good leverage point in their companies. So the first piece is around pipeline. The second is around building the right skills. And when we interview senior executives, and we just did an effort with a few hundred senior female leaders and asked them what were the characteristics that mattered most to you, the two that they highlight are grit and resilience. And when they talk about the situations they were in that provided that, it was really stretch opportunities that gave them the chance to go kind of beyond their comfort zone, and challenging situations that had real risk associated with it. And a number of them noted it wasn't just situations where they were risky and they succeeded, it was also those where they failed. And so the real question for a lot of institutions right now is, are your women receiving the same opportunities for stretch and for those challenge situations as men are? And when we interview and ask effectively that question, one of the issues from a perception standpoint is that men say there's no difference in the opportunities that we're presented with, and women say there is a difference. And so there's a significant perception gap in how they perceive the degree to which those stretch opportunities are coming their way. In addition, on the skills piece, the other part of it is what we're actually training people for. So a lot of institutions have recently been doubling down their efforts around gender diversity type training programs. But when we interview HR leaders and diversity leaders on the quality of those programs, what we hear self-reported is, I'd say 30% of them are high quality. That's what they're saying about their own programs. Then when we ask women and men, where are you spending your time in training? Women are saying, well, I'm being tapped for these gender diversity programs, so I'm attending those. But there's only a finite amount of time I can spend in training, and so then I'm not going to the other training events that are open to everyone on margin. The men are spending their time in the traditional programs and not often in the gender diversity programs, which are targeting women. So the question is, where we're trying to build the skills, are we building the right ones, and are we focusing on the quality that helps these women then succeed over time? The third area is really around sponsorship. And the distinction here is sponsorship vis-a-vis mentorship, right? Research shows consistently women in management positions are over-mentored and under-sponsored. And the distinction I'd make here is sponsorship is individuals in senior roles who agitate and open up opportunities for you, pound the table, draw you in to situations and networks where you don't have access, and create openings. And when we interview senior women about their reflections on their path, one of the biggest areas they cite, 60% of successful senior women say, I wish I had had more sponsorship and had actively been able to create more sponsorship. I didn't need more mentors. I had a lot of mentors. What I needed were more sponsors. And so there's a real question about how institutions are creating those opportunities. And there are some out there that are explicitly stating, of all their senior leaders, you need to actively name 5 women you're going to sponsor, and then they're following that up. And in places where they're doing that, they're actually seeing that translate into senior roles over time, more senior roles for women. Because the challenge when you have an unbalanced pyramid, as you know, is if you don't have enough men sponsoring the women at the same rate women, you just don't have enough women at the top to handle that pyramid and bring people up. So that's really the third area, is around sponsorship. The fourth is addressing unconscious bias. I mean, this has been getting a lot of play recently, and we'd argue everything we see in the research suggests this continues to be a really important and significant point. When we interview leaders about this question, what they say with a lot of frustration is that women are still promoted based on performance, while men are promoted based on potential. And no matter what we do, we haven't been able to flip the dynamic on that. And it plays through in a lot of ways that individually feel quite small, but start to accumulate and add up into something that's quite significant. So our latest research shows that female leaders are 30% more likely to be described using negative descriptors such as bossy, arrogant, aggressive, abrasive, difficult, right? And this is by both men and women. And we literally just asked these set of questions, how would you describe your boss? And people had all these different options to check off, right? And it skews substantially towards women being associated with these terms. Those things play through over time, right? And they can accumulate as part of this whole narrative that becomes women not getting access to those opportunities. Women are more likely to either volunteer themselves or be volunteered into event and social planning activities as some of their extracurriculars in company environments, and less likely to be tapped for being sounding boards to key business decisions in informal gatherings. And when we do the research with men, the numbers are literally flipped in terms of the degree that you see them participating. And then the final area is really around addressing policies. And this starts with things like maternity and paternity leave, flexible models. Importantly, we see institutions needing to focus on getting beyond the check the box mindset. So I revamped my maternity paternity policy, we're good. Right? And what you see is, well, what's the degree to which people are participating in these events, and are they doing so in a balanced way? And how successful are they coming in and coming out of those ramps? And a lot of institutions are not asking those second order questions. They're stopping at the first step. And in the research we've been doing lately, we found that the participation issue is actually a very significant one if you think about the imbalance it creates. So 93% of men self-report that they took less than 2 weeks leave with their latest child being born. 95% of women take more than 2 weeks. As someone who just had a third child, I cannot imagine taking less than 2 weeks. But you know, it's a very different. But I bet you were online even during the 2 weeks. Exactly, exactly.
So you weren't totally not working.
But you know, these very significant imbalances, right, that play through and have residual effects on how women play through the pipeline over time. And I guess, Jim, what I'd say to close on the data piece was I was sitting with a senior leader recently of a Fortune 500 institution, and we were talking about participating in the survey we have underway. And he admitted that he was really nervous about opening Pandora's box. And he said, I don't want to measure because I'm afraid of what I'm going to find. And the comment I shared back with him was, you know, if you believe this premise that women are a strategic priority, because winning the war for talent requires equally winning the war for female talent as well as male talent. And if you believe that you get what you measure, if you don't start looking, you're never going to get there, right? And I think that's at the heart of why this topic has become so prevalent for so many institutions now, is it really is the talent game. And I think the premise that this is a strategic priority, most companies now buy. What you do about it and how much you want to sort of open the kimono on what's inside and what it looks like today to get started, I think is where a number of institutions are struggling.
So Alexis, before I ask others for particular experiences and reactions, I think I heard you right in saying that companies that have got best practices going on and are addressing these 5 issues maybe come out at 30% of the C-suite being female. Yeah. That still sounds like a problem to me because the starting point is a 50-50 population. Yeah. So there's still something going wrong even with companies, maybe, even with, there's still some leakage, even with companies that do it well. Is that okay, or should we have a much better objective than that?
I think the objective needs to be substantially better. I think the objective needs to be parity, at a minimum parity to the aspiration. And when we evaluate women and men on their aspiration of progression early in their careers, it's very similar. And even women coming back from leaves of absence for things like children, it's still very similar. There's some differences at the CEO level, but very little as you progress towards the C-suite. So I don't think it's okay by any means. I think so many institutions are starting so far off from parity, and their pipeline, I can tell you, having looked at many of them, is so leaky throughout that getting just to 30% from where they were a couple years ago is significant progress. And so I think we have to view it as the beginning of something that I hope 10 years from now, we're frankly surprised at what the data used to say.
Yes, I'm very much of the same view as you are, Alexis. And I look at, we've done all these things in different ways over the last decade or so, pretty rigorously. And we now, on our board of directors, are 36% female. On the operating committee of Principal Global Investors, which I run, we're now 38% female. I actually think those are good numbers, but it's still a work in progress, would be how I would advise people to think of numbers like that. Dr. Fan, you have experienced, I guess, all of these different issues at different stages in your career, both in New York and in Beijing. And notoriously, Asia, I would guess, has more leakage as women go up the chain than perhaps is true in Europe or in the United States. We'd be very interested to hear your observations on how you found that and perhaps what organizations might think of doing better.
Sure, thank you, Jim. Well, it's actually a learning experience for me to hear from Alexia about all the issues behind the gender diversity. Well, I probably will just share what I experienced, and then hopefully people can draw some conclusions itself. So I grew up in China. We're kind of like educated women can do whatever men can. So in school, there was never an issue, and usually you probably see women do better than men. And then right now, I hear actually in college entrance exams or in other kind of things, I mean, they actually need to adjust the admission ratio to make sure men got represented by half. So that was the case in China.
Yep.
And then I went to graduate school here in the States and then joined Goldman Sachs right after school. So I worked from like entry-level employee to a small group manager to a later on manager, probably more than 20 people team. So Goldman's a place, I mean, that sort of really emphasized on excellence, not just in technical terms, but also in management. There's like the simple things they do, like work-life balance. They have like a longer maternity leave than any other Wall Street firms, and like they provide like facilities of emergency childcare, breastfeeding room. So all those things sort of helped. At least, I mean, I personally try to take advantage of that. And then there's also other front they have been doing. For example, like a training, not just like women's leadership training, but all around. Like from entry level, you probably will learn like how you manage your boss, and then getting things done, influence people, how do you manage a team, and then in the importance of diversity, because they do try to attract people all around, and then having a diverse group and they actually help you make better decisions at work. In addition, they have like a lot of women's networking events where you meet other women, talk about issues, and also you have the experience to meet like senior role models. Some will become your mentor. I probably would agree, probably less sponsorship, more mentoring there. But I think in the end, it does help me sort of to look at the issues differently and then progress in my own career. And then in the end, I guess all sort of things tie together. I mean, I guess during the lunch program, we'll probably hear about Rubin. Hank Paulson was saying about the reality. No matter what you do, maybe there's still a portion of women choose not to work anymore or pay a lot of attention to families. And then that's just reality. I think we probably, at least personally, I don't think that much of a, we probably need to reach a 50-50 kind of like a equal stance at any given point. But when I moved back to China and then worked in this investment firm, it turned out to be the case. In my department, we have like more women than men, both at entry level and also at like a management level. And then it turned out having the diversity helped us do better in the global investment, not just in terms of gender difference, but also we have people educated in China and also people educated and worked outside China and with different language skills, different like majors or specialize in different asset classes. So all things tie together. In the end, we get a much more diverse view of the world, and hopefully we don't miss much, and then it help us to make better investment decisions. Well, but once you get more women, you actually can I mean, sometimes people probably stereotype women too much. Within women, you actually have a lot of diversity as well. There are people more aggressive, less aggressive, and with all different kind of characters. So I tend to not to think that much about, I mean, we should get more women, but in the end, I think having a very diverse group helped a lot in my own career.
Yeah.
Thanks.
It helped in your career. Has that been successful at the highest level of the organization? I mean, we talked about 30 being quite good at the C-suite level. Is that where Goldman's is? Is that where CIC is?
Well, I mean, statistics probably reflect that. It's the same as everywhere else. Once you get to a very, very senior level, you have much less representative from women.
Yes.
Yeah.
Isn't that a problem, though?
It is, but it's also reality, right?
Yeah, but I'm not sure I want to accept it as reality.
We can try harder to
Yeah.
do better, but I think it's a gradual process. Once people see women can do better,
Yeah.
and they benefit from having women in their C-suite, and then it will
Yes.
happen.
But one of the things I was thinking as you were talking, Dr. Fan, is I could hear pieces that reflected all 5 stages that Alexis described in a state-of-the-art gender diversity program.
Yeah.
Anna Maria, I perhaps slightly boldly said to you in the preparation call that you're a very senior businesswoman in South America, in a part of the world that at least has a reputation for being one of the most macho, male swagger kind of parts of the world. And yet you've risen to the top in that part of the world and also have created a very diverse organization. I'd be very interested to hear your take on the challenges in doing that.
Well, thank you very much. I would like to start by saying I have 3 different types of perspectives that I wanted to share. One would be Colombia, the other one would be central banks in the region, and the other one would be FLAR, which I head. In Colombia, the situation is much less horrible than one would think. 53% of the workforce are women in medium and senior management. Of this 53%, only 16% get to the top. That's one of our first problems. If you look at a little bit the public sector in Colombia, the situation is the same. We have a lot of women in middle management, a lot of women in senior management, but we have only 16% of congresswomen. We only have a very few women in political parties. So that would be the situation in Colombia. I studied 27 central banks of the region. In those 27 central banks, there are only 4 CEOs, so 4 governors. There are only 9 members of board of directors. But in the second and third level, there are a lot of women. The percentage goes from 25 to 30. So something's happening with the link between senior to the top. And that's where you were talking about, Alexis, all the skills, because I think that it gets down to the skills that we're not promoting in women. So that's one of the things. FLAT is different because FLAT is head by women. So we have a woman-man parity. My second is a woman. We have very generous maternity leaves. We're flexible with a work balance, work-life balance, both for men and women. But I think it's a outlier because it's run by a woman. It's not the generality. So that's what I see. I see there's a tremendous gap between senior and the top. And I was very interested in all the research I did preparing this because I said, besides the skills that McKinsey describes, there must be more missing. There must be more. So there's a very interesting concept, like, researcher in women issues that talks about what is the 33% of career advancement skills that are missing in women? And there are three. There is a lack of insight to the business, a lack of strategic mindset, and a lack of fully understanding the financials of a company. So she says, if you could train women to do all these three things, you could, you know, narrow the gap that we have not been able to narrow in 40 years. So I think it comes down to skills. I mean, I think we're sponsoring, mentoring the wrong way. That's what I think.
On the flexible working topic, Anna Maria, isn't one of the unconscious biases that you see in organizations what I think some people call the anytime, anywhere culture? The fact that in order to get on in some organizations, you have to be perpetually available. And it's only some men and very few women that are prepared to be so crazy as to be available all the time. Is there an element of that?
I think that's a bias. In the case of FLAD, women are much more, work much longer hours. And
Yes.
Maybe it's because of the bias. So
It could
they
be
have
to
to do
counter
much
it.
more than the men to be at the same place.
Yeah.
But generally in FLAD, which we have a parity of men and women,
Mhm.
equally prepared with the set of
Yes.
skills they need to do their job.
Yeah.
Women work much harder.
And I would observe a very high-performing team. I mean, it just seems to be a very aligned and very high-performing team you have, which really supports, I think, the general argument for diversity. John, you're in a very different market, one that's probably more like the US, but still has issues, and is close to Asia.
We've got big issues, but the interesting thing is I was looking at the stats and we're very, very much in line with America in terms of the 30%. I work for a big bank in Sydney, and one of the board agendas is diversity across the organisation. We've got 57% of women in the workforce, and yet when we get up to board level, we're at just over 30 and patting ourselves on the back. We have a mentor program right through the organisation, from looking at the skills for board membership. Across the organisation on the boards, they want to get to close to 40% in the next 3 years, and I think that's a wonderful target, but I think it's, like Jim, probably too low. If we've got 57% of our workforce as females, we should have 50% of our management as females. But in looking and researching the topic, the thing that amazes me, because I've been 26 years being an asset consultant and looking into organisations around the world, financial institutions around the world, and the lack of females at the top level in financial services companies is amazing, particularly in asset management. I cannot name more than about a half dozen that I know of, and I've been in this industry 26 years.
I
And
hope more than one of them's with us.
yeah, but when you look at the top management, are they at the portfolio management level, the CEO level, and that part of the business? Because when I look around the world, there is this macho image, and I'm glad you're next, because this
I have a macho.
there is something wrong in the culture, and maybe it is the sponsorship or something else is happening. But if you go into funds management organisations, there is a definite lack of females. We were talking about this on the weekend, and I was talking to a friend who runs a funds management here in LA, and they go around the universities. And he made a comment that at one university, an MBA program, 26 of the brightest and best, no women. That just staggered me. So what is it about our industry, Jim, that turns women off?
One of our reactions to that has been to run annually for the last 4 or 5 years a Women in Asset Management conference, which is aimed at bright young women, mostly coming out of graduate school, some coming out of undergraduate in economics and finance. And we have had the whole program basically run by senior women in different roles of our organization. And that's not just about skills and knowledge, it's also showing them
Sponsorship.
that it's also just the demonstration effect that women can do it. But you know, John, Dr. Fan's comments suggested that in China, perhaps at the portfolio manager level, it might be a bit different.
It is
Have
different.
you seen that?
In Asia, it is definitely different. It
Yeah.
is completely different in Asia. You actually see a lot more female portfolio managers, senior women running their own companies, running the business up there, whereas in Australia, for instance, there's 147 Australian equity management firms. I think there's one run by a female, you know, where they're the managing partner.
Yes, so
It's
there's work.
staggering.
So there's work to do.
It's in our
So what would
industry,
you do
there's
about
something
it?
and
What would you do about it, John?
Well, Jim, we talked about this. I'm not certain I know the answer because I think it comes down to there's something wrong in the way asset management firms are run that prevents women from wanting to even aspire to be in them, let alone run them. So we've got a real big issue about getting them in the door first.
Yes, and that does need work and care because if cultures are excessively macho, many people you want to have in the organisation
Won't come.
won't come. And Claire, be interested to hear your take on that because, you know, as I said, you straddle technology and finance, which are two of the most difficult areas for women, actually.
Yeah, I set up a tech accelerator in London focused on fintech. It's called Level 39. I've been doing that over the last couple of years, and recently set up this organization called Innovate Finance, which is to help foster the tech-led transformation of financial services. So I've often found myself the only woman in the room, and work with a lot of young female entrepreneurs to help them gain access to finance, business opportunities, and try and take a go at this sector themselves. I think if there's an industry that's in need of healthy decision making at the top levels of its organization, it's financial services. If I think there's an industry that needs beautifully designed products, well packaged and communicated to consumers, that's the tech industry. And if I think there's more you can do for entrepreneurship, it's to get these gritty, resilient founders and entrepreneurs out there and support them in their journey. I don't know, women represent the most grittiest, resilient characters that I know. A couple points, to echo Alexis's research that she eloquently laid out for us. I just wanted to touch upon a couple points to bring to bear my experience. One is the talent pipeline. There are 60% of the financial services industry is comprised of women. It's not as if there's a lack of talent. So frankly, I think part of the role is to shine a light on this talent. It's part of the reason why we produce this magazine called The Women in FinTech, because there are many female FinTech founders. They just don't make it to the front pages of the magazine. And there are plenty of women to choose from, but it's our job to reach out, bring them into the professional development programs that we want to develop them, and put them into these positions. Yes, providing them with big challenges. Yes, providing them with sponsors. But I think that the talent is there. To touch upon the skills point, which I think was really interesting, and I would echo that the skills that are required really need to be more strategic in nature, need to be more finance focused. As a female founder or a woman who's highly ambitious, I think some of the skills you should focus on are not just your own personal assertiveness training, but get obsessed with commercialization. How do I ask the commercial questions at all times? And how do I inform my contributions to the business by data? How do I get more obsessed with data? You cannot argue with statistics in a boardroom, and frankly, you can undermine me as much as you like, but I've got some stats here. They're driven by this information. Here is it well presented in this commercial document. Are you going to argue with that? And I would say the other skill that you would need, along with the obsession with commercialization and data analytics, is a lot of humor, because in this industry, you are going to be undermined. I am undermined on a daily basis. And there are so many social biases.
Only daily.
Actually, yeah, it's probably more hourly, actually.
That's what I was thinking.
Yeah.
Probably on your Twitter account right now.
Yeah, absolutely, no doubt about it. I'm sure there's lots of thoughts going around in the room at the moment. But anyway, I think you need to develop a very quick wit and be able to come back to the comments that you find are undermining in those moments in the boardroom, where you are, where you're not provided the opportunity or you are undermined in some way. So just a couple other points on the unconscious bias. I learned two really interesting words this year. One was called manterruptions, which is where you're sitting in a boardroom and you're in the midst of an excellent presentation. You might be the leader, you might be at the top level of that room, and you might have the most information and all the slides, and you're leading the conversation, but you get interrupted in the middle of your sentence. And so I've read this term, manterruptions. So, ladies and gentlemen, when you're in a room and you notice a woman who's speaking and holding that audience and she is interrupted in the middle, you can say, hold on, I just want to hear that, I just would like to hear her finish. So, so there's very specific things we can do in those moments. The other term that I learned was called manpropriation. And that is when your idea is taken from you very quickly. Your idea, you've said this, you've generated the creative impulse. You've had the guts to go out there and be creative in this room, be vulnerable, and speak up. And then somebody else is, and then it's reiterated by a man, perhaps more senior, a bit more gray hair. All of a sudden, it becomes the best idea in the room. That is called manpropriation.
Aren't those both, deep down, just features of a good culture? Is that people are allowed to finish and not interrupted mid-sentence, and that credit is given where credit is due. Aren't those both just features of a positive culture?
Absolutely, but I guarantee that the women in the room have experienced this multiple times more than the men.
I would agree that. I would agree, and I've seen it. So no, that is correct. Yeah. Maybe I could, shift gears here, because I do want to try and get some specifics to come out of this. Anna Maria talked about flexible working. One of our observations over the last decade, we're a global firm. We have people in all time zones. That requires flexible working skills, because you have people impacting the same client's business in really all three time zones. That requires you to have collaboration culture. If people can work in the US, in London, and in Singapore on a single client, why can't a few of them work from home? It's not that difficult. The same technology as makes you global can give you some of the flexibility that's needed to make these things work. There are other specifics I can think of, but maybe a quick run through the panel to see if they have any specific ideas. And I've kind of stolen yours, by the way, Anna Maria, talking about flexible working, but maybe if you have any other hints that people might find helpful in emulating your achievements in this.
Well, I would think that flexible hours and like a culture of a little bit what Claire was saying, that people recognize that women are as capable as men. Maybe it's just a simple idea, but in Latin America, it's not that well acknowledged.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
One. And two, there's this issue of if women can have it all or not. So there's that discussion, because it goes to your idea. Why women wouldn't go on to go into the asset management? Because women want to have it all, and maybe they can't do it if it's so absorbing, etc. So I think it could be a very interesting discussion too, that how do you make it easier for both men and women to have it all? Because
it's fair. Dr. Fan, any thoughts as to what if you have one piece of advice to give organizations to do this better, any thoughts as to what it might be?
Well, maybe I'll just take the other side of the flexible work arrangement. Sometimes it actually hurts me because let's say we do global investing and then we work in Beijing, and usually that means probably the majority of the trading hour happens during our non-working hours.
Yes.
And because of the flexible working arrangement or the technology that allow us to do work probably 24 hours a day, that actually make my job a lot harder. So, so sometimes I say, well, maybe I should have a fixed time to work.
Yeah. So that in itself is flexibility. It's letting the policies be suited to the workforce you've got, I guess, is what you're saying.
But in the end, once you start managing a larger team and you have to learn to delegate, there are definitely things other people can help you with. So that's a way to sort of get you a less workload.
Yep. John, quick hints?
Well, Jim, my quick one is be very flexible around the work-life balance, because the number of conversations I've had with the young 30-year-olds or late 20s, early 30s in my working environment where they're scared to tell you that they've just got pregnant. And I had the experience just before I left. We offer a very big range of and are super accommodative about our female workforce, how long they have off when they have their children, the flexible hours they're going to come back on. We have numerous discussions about it, and that flexibility has enabled us to retain, I'm going to say it's over 85% of our female senior people coming back into the organisation. Now, some haven't stayed, they've moved on with their career and gone on, but the one thing they've always said back to us is, you were fantastic around that period of our life. And I think that's the one period where women feel very vulnerable.
Yeah. Claire?
I just, in the UK, we've mandated flexible working hours. So every employee is now allowed to ask for this in their work. I think what's happening now is there's a new gender equality when it comes to child rearing. So a lot more men are looking to take time off as well, so that a business, when you're making your decision about whether I hire this 30-something female or this 30-something male, it's not going to matter, because you're going to have to provide the same kind of flexibility and leave to the man and to the woman, because now they're saying anyone who gets pregnant, then you get the same amount of time off, and you split it. And if the man doesn't take it, then you lose that time. And that's a really interesting way of incentivizing better parenting done on a national level. And I think it equalizes the gender biases there. So I think that's an important form of flexibility.
Alexis, you started off with some very practical hints, your 5 stages. Anything you'd like to emphasize following this discussion?
You know, what I'd say is I'd encourage the honest look and conversation at what does the data suggest is happening underneath. So I think a lot of institutions have started putting in place the fundamentals, but it's not translating particularly well or particularly fast. And I think it's worth taking the look to say, what is that? Is there something in there about how it's being adopted, who's making use of it? So these ideas about even paternity, maternity, it's great in concept. Very few men are taking advantage of it. And when we get underneath why, a number of them will state, because even though we're told we can do the bounce back and there's no problem, I look at this and I go, ooh, that's going to be a tough re-ramp, you know, back on. And that's precisely what every woman who takes it faces when she comes in. And so I think getting down to that level, and what I'd say is the one benefit of really poor numbers of women at the top is that you can actually solve this in some cases by a segment of one. At very senior levels in a lot of companies, it's a person-by-person strategy that works best. And while that does not scale, the reality is a lot of institutions are not yet at the point where they have anything that resembles numbers that suggest they need to be at they need a scaled solution yet. And if you're trying to solve at the senior level first, if you believe to some degree, you know, as was stated, that some of this is about having the right role models and people at the top, you can solve this at a segment of one.
I think I'm told there is a microphone somewhere. And I would invite anyone who wants to either ask a question or make a comment, please. Over here we have, towards the back first, I think. Or we have the mic, yes. The gentleman's got the mic.
Okay, thank you.
See.
Just kidding. Well, it's not a question, but I just wanted to say something in favor of my country, as I came from Brazil. And probably everybody here in this room thinks that we have a very strong macho mentality, what is not true. For example, women are invading the soccer field, for example. Yes.
So women can misbehave just like men.
They're taking power. And acting
president.
as referees in the football. We call it football.
Yep.
And for example, in the asset management industry, of the 4 biggest asset management companies in Brazil that are associated to big banks, Itaú, Bradesco, Banco do Brasil, and Santander, 2 in 4 are women and 2 are men, 50-50. But you may say, what about the other ones? Oh, almost all are commanded by men. But I think that the point is that normally CEOs are old people like me, Jim, and John there. And in Brazil, mentality has evolved a lot along the last 2 or 3 decades, you know. So they still didn't have time. They haven't had time to reach there. Just that. It's a question of time.
Yeah, maybe in Brazil, one of the most powerful female role models would be a football referee. The lady at the front had a question or comment. I'm taking that as really a comment, Everaldo. Is that fair? Yeah.
Elizabeth Hewitt with the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. And mine is a bit more of a comment. Having a 3.5-year-old, the foundation is very flexible, and due to their flexibility, I probably stayed in the workforce. But I wish there was more work done on the fallout, especially around the time when women have children and the physiological impact on their bodies and brains, that they come back functioning at a lower level for a while. It takes about a year for the brain to recover. And I think that answers a lot of the questions of why there is so much fallout, and that institutions with more flexibility and longer maternity leave probably give a woman a much better chance at coming back at a stronger level and then succeeding. Where, in the U.S., I don't know what our average maternity leave is, but it's short, and so you're coming back and you're over-fenced. You don't have a hope in hell of succeeding. And it's true, right?
Yes, that would argue for Australia's policies as opposed to the US policies.
Right.
Ours are much longer.
But if there was more, we bring up all these issues, and they seem to be the same issues every year. Although I love seeing all the men in the room this year, because last year there weren't as many men. But I wish there was more work done on that physiological side of things. So that's just.
Do you have any thoughts on that, Alexis?
I think, what we're finding is certainly in the U.S., the mandated leave is so short relative to many other countries. What we're certainly finding is that in the context of that, managing the outbound and return ramp is critically important, because there are just so many elements of what you have to do when you transition your career to someone else, and then so little expectation about how that will be handed back to you and how you build momentum, that this idea that the effect is only the 12 or 13 weeks of the absence is just completely wrong on so many different levels. So I think it's a very valid point.
Yeah.
A couple examples of responses to that. There is now what's called a returnship, and it's championed by Morgan Stanley and Goldman Sachs, and it's a 10-week return to work program that gets you back in the game. And I think that other corporations can develop this concept of a returnship, not just for women, but for men who've been on career breaks as well.
And what are they doing there?
I guess it's a kind of get back to work program that gets you back into the pace of the job, into, I mean, it would be dependent upon the role and dependent upon the organization. But they've been pioneering this concept of returnships for people to get them back. And they're paid for, obviously, and they're incentivized to participate in them.
Hi, Mimi Drake, Chair of the Board of 100 Women in Hedge Funds. And I agree with the comment that Claire made that there actually are a lot of women in high-level positions. Not enough, but there are more than maybe what people think in very high-level positions, particularly in asset management-related fields, and women who control large sums of money that nobody ever hears about. So part of what we see is that the women in these high-level positions tend to be more private. They're not in the public eye. They're not in the press, partly because they get called bossy and things like that when they are. But I'm just curious, Alexis, I don't know if any of the data shows what impact that has. It has to have a negative impact, and I'm wondering if you've looked at that at all.
So specifically,
just the fact that women are not, the women in high-level positions just are not public, and they're not out there as such.
That's true.
Yeah, I think, I think this idea that's evolving rapidly, but that women need to solve the women's issue is just false fundamentally in so many ways. And I think historically that's been the idea, and what that's left is very few women holding a very huge responsibility. Some of whom have access to the levers they need to help make changes, but many of whom don't have full access or influence. And I think that, I think certainly what we've seen is that, first of all, there's a lot of data that suggests you need the most senior level, very visible, very committed sponsorship of changing the game for women, and that has to be whoever sits at the top, whether it's male or female. And it needs to be very visible, it needs to be personal, but it has to be followed up with things like metrics and commitments that they're held to, and that makes a huge difference. And to the degree that women are either not given enough of the spotlight to promote that, or choose not to try and be the one figure to represent everyone in that role, which a lot of people aren't comfortable taking on that mantle, I think it does hurt the cause.
But to Alexis's point, I think we've all seen cases, at least I certainly have on many times, when a woman does something and is described as bossy and difficult for doing exactly what if a man did, he'd be described as assertive and decisive. And I think it's incumbent on senior managers to diffuse those situations and say, hey, get off it. It's not quite true. That would be one of my takes on that.
Yes. Good comments. Jim, Dan Houston, Principal Financial Group. Just one observation. It seems like it's kind of all or nothing, that you went out working, you came back, and you got to get right back to where you're at after 5 weeks or 8 weeks or whatever the case might be. I think about our chief actuary, Ellen LaMele, who literally went to a part-time status for over 5 years to raise her kids. But the load was lightened, and I don't mean, it was certain other aspects of her job were delegated out. She still remained our chief actuary. She did an incredible job, and part-time probably wasn't 20 hours. Part-time was probably 30 as opposed to 60. But I think that's another one of those items that maybe add to that list of, what are the potential ways that you can structure
But Dan, she must have had a sponsor. She must have had a sponsor
no question.
within
Dave
the
Drury,
organisation.
our chairman, was her sponsor. But that's true in all these instances. But I think we have to be more creative, more thoughtful about what are the alternative choices to maximize these highly skilled individuals in any organization. And whether it's part-time for 5 years or 7 years, it went awfully, awfully fast. And she went on to have an incredible career with the organization.
Yep.
That's great.
Yes, please.
Thanks very much. Carissa Zarin from Moody's Corporation. I'm a relatively senior woman in my company, and I have a 5.5-year-old daughter, and I guess one of the things that I constantly think about in balancing these two things is, when we're talking about a corporate environment, is there some connection, or isn't there, from a broader environmental perspective, in the sense that does education come into the way that kids are treated even as children, right, when in classes? If we're talking about finance, which is my industry, and yes, I am generally the only woman in the room, the fact that, and I see it in my daughter, that if a little girl gets a math problem right, oh wow, isn't that great, whereas it's kind of expected for a little boy, and that type of sort of association just kind of grows and grows. So that's one. And then the expectations on a family life perspective, there are expectations. And so all of that kind of combines, and by the time you come into the workplace, there's everything that you've also talked about. So is there something that you can speak to with respect to the entire package rather than just simply the workplace environment?
Quick comment on that?
Yeah, one of my favorite new toys is called Goldie Box. Has anyone heard of this? It was started by this Stanford graduate, and it's basically a motherboard, and it teaches, but it's a motherboard designed for young girls to teach them how to basically and basic engineering skills. But it comes with a book because it's been shown that young girls aged 1 to 5 like to read through things and have a different learning style. Yeah, they're very more literate in their approach to learning. So we've designed new math-based, science-based toys for young girls, but just using the method of learning that they tend to prefer. I think that's one thing that that we should develop. The other thing that's happening in the UK are all these really niche girls-only coding clubs. So Code First Girls, which I sponsor at the Accelerator, they come and they use the space for free. And we've developed these really strong group of girls, and it's Geek Girls, it's Code First Girls, Code Academy, and they're all these girls-only, no boys allowed code clubs. And these kind of powerhouses of computer science learning is a really great after-school program for young girls to get really excited about computer science, and I think that's a good initiative.
I'm so sorry, but I'm told the session has to end at this point. I was also very anxious that I was being told the session was over, and I couldn't interrupt Claire mid-sentence.
Oh, yeah.
Not that I ever would have done, but not that I ever would have done. But thank you. But I would like to thank a tremendous group of panelists for sharing their insights in what I regard as a very important strategic topic. Thank you all for attending, and thank you to the panelists.